Right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Charles Shapiro, the President of World Affairs Council of Atlanta, and I want to welcome you to our program today with Minority Leader Stacey Abrams on challenges facing global democracies. A couple of things. Whoops, let me fix this a little bit. I want to give a shout out to Atlanta City Council Representative Amir Faroqi, my City Council representative, and to the Consuls General of Israel, Korea, and the United Kingdom, and to Bill Clifford, who's the president of the World Affairs Councils of America, the umbrella organization that we belong to. I want to thank the Atlanta Global Studies Center for supporting the council and for sponsoring today's program. Dr. Tony Lemieux from Georgia State University is the co-director of the Atlanta Global Studies Center. Tony, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much for having us here and to participate in this event. It's an honor. Stacey Abrams is an amazing leader, and the Atlanta Global Studies Center is here to build an international awareness, global competence, advanced learning. It's a partnership between Georgia State University and Georgia Tech, supported by the U.S. Department of Education. And we're here to really serve as a hub and empower the region's global educational agenda.
Thanks, Tony. I appreciate it. So a couple of admin words for y'all. Please, we're going to keep everybody's microphone and video off so that we use less bandwidth and hopefully have fewer technical problems. Use the chat function, the Zoom chat functions down the bottom of your screen if you put your cursor over it. Send questions to Fernanda Lucchine, my colleague. She'll send an email to everybody. She'll edit the questions, combine similar questions, and send them to me in all caps so that I can actually read them. And somewhere around 12:30, we'll start with questions from the audience. So please send your questions to Fernanda. And now, Stacey Abrams, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Stacey Abrams served in the Georgia House of Representatives from 2007 to 2017, served as minority leader from 2011 to 2017. As all of us Georgians know, she ran for governor in 2018. She's now the CEO of Fair Fight, which promotes fair elections and encourages voter participation. She's a graduate, this is probably one of the few times that you'll hear this, of Avondale High School, which for those of you who are not from Atlanta, it's too bad. From Spelman College, magna cum laude, the University of Texas, where she got a master's in public administration, and from Yale Law School. Stacey, your focus until now has been domestic issues, especially voting. You wrote an article that ran in Foreign Affairs magazine on May 1 entitled, "American Leadership Begins at Home." What caused you? Why are you writing an article in Foreign Affairs? What's up with that?
Well, first of all, Ambassador, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all of you for joining us. While my academic focus has largely been domestic policy, I have long had an interest in foreign policy. In fact, when I was in grad school at the University of Texas, I wrote a chapter on the redemocratization of Brazil for our journal. And I was challenged early on in my academic career. I was challenged by a friend of mine at the end of my senior year of college to really think about how my focus on domestic policy required that I have a deeper understanding of foreign policy. And being the nerd I am, I began independently to undertake a number of fellowships. I worked with the German Marshall Fellowship. I did work with the American Assembly at Columbia University. I did work with the Salzburg seminars, and I found multiple ways to enlarge my understanding. And I think he was right, my friend who challenged me, because what he helped me understand is that it deepened and widened my capacity to be of service. When I became a state legislator, part of my job was to represent the state on foreign soil in Israel, in Taiwan, in Korea. I've met with the consul generals here. You mentioned 3 of them that I've developed very deep relationships with, because part of the responsibility as a minority leader in the House was to be a voice for the state of Georgia, to represent the state on foreign soil, but also to be a conduit here at home. And writing this piece was a natural extension of the work I've been doing for 25 years, which is to never let myself be limited by my place, physical place, but to understand the interconnectedness of our world. And if nothing puts that into sharp relief, the COVID pandemic should. What we saw happen with COVID-19, what we're watching happen, not only with our elections here in America, but around the world, is the lack of barrier between our nations, the lack of borders, and the necessity for us to understand what it means to be an interconnected world in the 21st century.
Well, if you're a foreign policy nerd, the World Affairs Council's the place for you.
Absolutely.
So it's where we all get together. U.S. fatalities from COVID-19 are falling. According to today's New York Times, down 47% in the last 2 weeks. All 50 states are reopening their economies. Why do you believe the U.S. is failing in dealing with the pandemic?
Because while we are watching a decline, we have seen states like Georgia also see spikes. Over the last 7 days, Georgia's incident rate went up by 26%. And we know that we may be coming to the bottom of the first peak of COVID-19, of the first wave, but it's not over. And part of what is happening is that as we reopen prematurely and without uniformity, we're going to see spikes. In the state of Georgia, not only has there been a 26% increase in the last 7 days, but we saw rural communities across the country start to experience what urban communities have been going through for the last few months. I co-authored a piece with former Senator Tom Daschle, thinking about what our rural communities are facing. And the reason it's so critical that we have this conversation about failure is that we know to this day, we still do not have adequate PPE for our frontline workers. We are watching a spike in incident rates of infection among meat workers and poultry workers who are being forced to work because of the president's decision that their lives mattered less than his sense of what the economy should be. We are watching across the country as contact tracing is erratic, which means we are unable, as we reopen borders, people who may be subject to contact tracing in one state may not have that same responsibility in another state, and they can bring the disease with them. And because we don't have uniformity in testing, we know that COVID-19 has not been vanquished in the United States. And it's been our failure of responsiveness and failure of responsible testing and tracing that's going to keep us in jeopardy's way. The United States has the single highest infection rate and the single highest death rate. And there is no sign of that abating simply because we wish it to be so. The failure begins at the top with the failure of the president to not only listen to his advisors, but to model good behavior. And we are watching as our social fabric rips as people use absence of good behavior, of failure to wear their masks as a sign of independence, as opposed to a sign of, I would say, a very deep and gross misunderstanding of the science of this disease. And so we need modeled at the top good behavior, but we also need modeled at the top the right investment to safely reopen our economy, to protect our people, and to ensure that our elections continue. Because the last piece of this goes back to the democracy question of America. We watched South Korea handle the single largest election in 30 years in the midst of COVID-19. Yet the United States is grappling with 50 different states trying to make certain they can meet the moment of our democracy in the 2020 election, but with erratic and sometimes controversial decisions being made by state and local officials, bolstered by a president who is claiming falsely that their ability to cast a ballot should be put in jeopardy because otherwise we face rampant voter fraud. That's not true. And what it's doing is undermining not only confidence in our elections, but confidence in our leadership. And that is a danger not only in America, but to our model around the world.
Are mail-in ballots an invitation to fraud?
Not at all. In fact, even the most, if you look at the Heritage Foundation, they have the most aggressive tracking of issues of voter fraud, and they could only identify a minuscule fraction of votes compared to the billions of votes that get cast. But even the most, arduous opponent of vote by mail can't point to evidence that it's problematic. But we do know that it is safe. It is safer to have people vote from home than it is to have them vote in person. We know it's accessible. Every single state in the nation has vote by mail. The issue is, what are the restrictions that are put in place? What are the barriers that voters have to cross to access it? We're watching this play out in Texas, where the fact that they could contract a disease, the Texas Supreme Court said that that should not be a disability, that you should not be able to vote by mail in the state of Texas because you may contract COVID-19. that impediment is not grounded in any fear of voter fraud. In fact, the President of the United States in 2017 convened a blue ribbon panel to prove incidents of fraud. It was such an abject failure, they disbanded before they could produce a report. We know voter fraud, especially mail-in ballot fraud, is not real. We also know that the president regularly uses vote by mail, that a number of his cabinet members do so, that his press secretary does so. This is not a question of fraud, this is a question of access, about how we want our democracy to work. And if more people can participate, we have a better sense of what people want, which is the nature of representative democracy.
But there are challenges with vote by mail. I mean, in the last election, apparently hackers got into the voting registries of a number of states. I mean, I don't want to say it's easy, but what precaution should the state of Georgia or the state of, you name it, New York do to protect voter polls and
Absolutely.
You know, do you send out a ballot to everybody? Do you wait till people request the ballot? I mean, what's good practice in this regard?
And I think that's a very legitimate issue. So there's a conflation of the challenges we face in voting, in part because we have such a fractured system. The United States is one of the few democratized, industrialized nations that administers its elections in such a fractured way. So we don't have one single democratic process. We have 50 different states that all operate under their own systems. And we have a vague baseline, but even that baseline is tenuous. The issue with hackers has been a question of the database accuracy. Right. What happened was not that people were illegally receiving ballots, it's that people who were legally entitled to vote were precluded from doing so because their information was false. And we saw that happen in Georgia, we saw it happen in Florida and in Wisconsin, where people who were legally eligible to vote would show up to register or show up to vote only to find their names disappeared from the rolls. In fact, the cousin of Martin Luther King Jr. at the age of 92 was told she didn't exist for the first election since 1968 because of a database error.
Right.
But those errors should not preclude our intent to make certain that every eligible American has the right to vote. And there are gold standards for ensuring that this happens. Sending out the applications to every single person who is eligible to vote means that you are moving people out of line who otherwise could put other people in jeopardy. Mm-hmm. And let's be clear, we don't want simply to have mail-in voting universally. That doesn't work. We have states like Oregon and Utah and Washington State and Colorado that have moved to vote by mail, but they have largely homogenous populations. We know that the more diverse your population, the more likely it is that you're going to have multiple ways to vote. That's why the best practice is to get as many people to vote by mail as possible, but to then also make certain you have expanded access to in-person early voting. The gold standard is about 15 days. And then to also allow for people to vote in person on election day. The reason in-person voting is so critical is that we have people who have disabilities, who have language barriers, who are homeless, who have been displaced by COVID-19, or to your point, may have experienced difficulty in receiving their ballots, who still should have the right to vote. These are things we can accomplish because every single mechanism necessary already exists in every single state. It is a question of scale and of investment. The scale can happen if the federal government passes the HEROES Act and invests the money in states to allow them to start now to create the administrative mechanisms they need to move this forward. But we're also seeing it play out in states that have used these mechanisms. They're seeing higher turnout and they're seeing safer elections, particularly because you can audit those ballots that come back in by mail. Those are things that we can do, and those are things we have seen other nations do. As I said, South Korea has done this exact thing in the midst of COVID-19, and if they can do it, the United States can too.
You argue in your article that I'm quoting you here, the greatest challenge to liberal democracy today comes not from overseas threats, but from domestic dysfunction. First of all, for those of us who haven't had a political science class in a while, what does liberal democracy mean? I mean, this is little L liberal, not capital L liberal, right?
Yes. So liberal democracy refers to those organizations, those nation states that not only believe in democratic representation, representative democracy, but also in a rule of law. They tend to have open markets, they tend to have economic freedoms, and they tend to have, they tend to be a civil society organized around using the voice of the people through representative democracy to set the rule of law.
Okay, so now, domestic...
Any political science professor will please forgive me for my Wikipedia version answer, but that is the shorthand version.
Well, I appreciate the brevity. So talk about domestic dysfunction. You were famous in the Georgia legislature for working across the aisle and for working with the Republican governor. Where's the dysfunction?
So the dysfunction comes about in part because instead of us having a federal response to COVID-19, we've indeed had to watch state and local actors step in where the federal government should have. It is the nature of our democracy and the nature of our structure that when there's a crisis that faces every American, our expectation is that the leadership begins at the top. And that has not happened in this crisis. In fact, what we've seen instead is that states and mayors, that governors and mayors have had to make, unfortunately, balkanized decisions in order to protect their fiefdoms and their people rather than being able to look to the president and the federal government for action. But we're also seeing this play out, and I say that we should focus on the domestic dysfunction because we're seeing it replicated. The model that Donald Trump began with is being replicated by a Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and we're seeing a concomitant effect where just as we saw a spiking of our infection rate and a spiking of our disease, he is watching the same thing play out in Brazil with the same type of dysfunction where the governors in Brazil are being forced to step in where the federal government should. But the other challenge is that the comparison is that you have illiberal states like China, where you are watching their nation states actually address the disease, or at least be able to point to a safer response in comparison to those incompetent democracies. And the more China can use the United States as an example of the failure, not of competence, but a failure of democracy, then they can bastardize our behavior and use it to justify an expression and an expansion of their autocracy. And we are leaning into that by continuing to not successfully solve this problem. I would point out one example. We're watching, because of the United States domestic dysfunction, the president decided that he was going to pull out of support of the WHO. Because of the United States' refusal to be an active participant, and more importantly, to deny resources, we've given China even more power in that process, which means that Taiwan, one of the few nation states that has successfully dealt with not only the pandemic of COVID-19, but prior to that dealt with the issue of SARS, President Tsai and her cabinet have done an extraordinary job of addressing this issue, and yet they do not have audience in the WHO. And because of the weakened American position, they were also denied a voice, both as an observer in the WHO, but also as an attendee in the World Health Assembly. That is a direct result of the dysfunction in America, because we cannot hold ourselves out as a moral leader, but also as an international leader. Those who have the right answers aren't being given audience either.
You refer in the article to the false allure of autocracy.
Yes.
Is autocracy on the march internationally?
Absolutely. 2019, for the 14th year in a row, liberal democracy has fallen, political freedom has fallen, and autocracy is winning. We are seeing that play out. As I mentioned, although he's been less successful than some might have imagined in South America, we see that Bolsonaro is attempting that type of behavior. But we know that Viktor Orban in Hungary has basically consolidated power and has been able to limit access to democracy in his nation state. We have seen glimpses of that with Narendra Modi in India. We are watching it play out in Poland and across Eastern Europe. We know that autocracy wins when democracy seems to put people at risk. And what is happening is that as the United States has pulled back from its moral posture, but also its strength, we have seen autocracy fill that vacuum. And it is attractive in the midst of a crisis to have someone just tell you what to do to survive. And that's what autocracy does. It says that our survival, that your survival depends on our power. And to the extent democracies like the United States falter and fumble and disassociate themselves from responsibility, the concomitant result is that instead autocracies start to rise and their allure becomes even more strengthened, because there is no long-term plan from the United States or any other nation state to say how they will solve this problem on the national and global scale when the next crisis hits.
Should we feel threatened by China when China helps countries around the world deal with COVID?
We should be concerned, in part because we have to think of this not simply as a moment of COVID-19, but as a continued press by China to replace the United States as the international humanitarian and therefore as an international leader. We can't divorce their humanitarian response on COVID-19 from the Belt and Road Initiative. because in each of those moments, they are stepping in Asia, in the Americas, in Africa, and they're saying to these communities and to these countries, you can rely on us, you cannot rely on them. Again, international affairs do not happen in a vacuum. And every time China steps up and says, we're going to help you survive this, when they go to Nigeria, when they go to Lagos, when they go to Indonesia, at the exact same moment when the governor of Wisconsin, the governor of Michigan is involved in a Twitter battle with the president of the United States who refuses to serve his own people, what we see play out is this notion that China not only has access and capacity, but that they also have the authority to support others. We are fumbling at home while they step into a vacuum. And we have to remember that people recall fondly those who support them, and they remember very vividly those who did not serve. And right now, the United States is not providing service. A few ventilators to Honduras is not the equivalent of providing medical supplies and constant support to which is what China is providing across the world.
Editorial writers came up with a great new phrase this week, vaccine nationalism, a phrase I'd never heard before. When all these companies and laboratories that are working to find a vaccine to prevent COVID, when we finally have one, there will, by definition, be a shortage of doses of that vaccine. I mean, you just can't create enough for the US population, for the world population. What should be the priority, both domestically, in terms of who gets it first, besides you and me, and internationally, if it's a US company that comes up with that vaccine, do we wait till everybody in the US has been vaccinated before we start sharing the vaccine internationally? How would you deal with that?
I think it's a false premise that we are going to necessarily have to cordon off the United States for service before others. We are going to have to prioritize the most vulnerable, which is what we've done with almost every international challenge we have faced. You serve those who are most vulnerable first, but we also have the capacity through the Defense Production Act, and if we maintain them appropriately through international relationships, that we should be able to produce vaccines at a rate necessary to deploy it around the world. Because fundamentally, simply providing vaccinations to Americans does not protect America. And that's the importance of understanding the new reality of pandemics. My youngest sister used to work for the CDC before I stole her away to come and work with me on census work. But she studied disease and disease control. And the reality is that these are not diseases that recognize international borders. The failure to provide an international solution to vaccination means we will constantly be at risk. And we need to understand that the first iteration of vaccine does not mean that we are suddenly shielded and protected. If we recall what happened with the polio vaccine, with the smallpox vaccine, this is going to be a multi-stage, multi-year process, which means we have to begin with the notion that we have to treat as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, as broadly as possible. And that should be how we start to think about global health security writ large. We cannot localize our health security by forgetting that these diseases may not originate here, but they will eventually and inevitably find their way to our shores. So our responsibility is to begin our work by serving the entire world and not simply being localized and parochial in our response.
Well, let's assume it's the other way around, because in fact, there is no reason to think it will be a US company that comes up with this first. It could just as easily be a Chinese or German or you name it. I mean, what if the country that discovers this decides their citizens should all be vaccinated before they share it internationally? How should we respond to that?
And that's one of the challenges of how our international relationships have broken down under the current president. We do not have the current leverage to build the coalition to put the pressure on that nation state to provide service and to provide a universal response. And that's one of the reasons we have to reassert our global leadership today so that we're in a position to be at the bargaining table. There is no nation state that is going to discover this vaccine that is not going to also need access to either economic capacity or to social supports. Something else will be necessary. And our ability to be the leader in that conversation, which we should be, because we have done this for decades, for generations, and we should not cede that capacity. But it can only be made real if we do the work now of rebuilding those relationships, of hardening those postures where people believe that if they say, yes, we will work with you, that they can trust our word. And let's be clear, one of the challenges we face today in our international conversations is that we no longer enjoy the trust of our allies, let alone of our opponents. And if they cannot trust our word, they will not rely on us and they will not turn to us, which is why we also have to bolster those who still have strong relationships. That's why it's so disturbing to me when we watch not only our trade war with China, but the trade war we're waging against the EU and against Canada. When we diminish our allies, we give them less and less responsibility for standing with us in times of crises, and we weaken their ability to be our emissaries when we have challenges, as you might imagine. China holds the vaccine, but Xi Jinping is still angry at Trump. We need to make certain that we have emissaries who can go forth and stand in our stead to help us solve this problem, because it is a global problem.
I'm going to pause for just a second here, encourage people to send questions to Fernanda. Hopefully she's busy editing them and getting ready to send them to me. You talked earlier about domestic dysfunction just in our party system with two parties. Is one party the party of good governance and the other party the party of domestic dysfunction? I mean, how don't we have a systemic problem more than a party problem?
We have a systemic problem, but I would say that the genesis of this challenge really does rest on the Republican Party, and here's why. We have watched a 40-year assault on the nature of bureaucracy that was led by the Republican Party. This notion that we should, to quote Grover Norquist, we should shrink government so small that we can drown it in a bathtub. That belief system has been adopted almost wholesale by the Republican Party, and by its nature, when you say that you want to shrink the size of government, what you're speaking about is shrinking the size of the infrastructure that can respond to crises. We have also not only tried to shrink it, but we've watched the Republican Party diminish its legitimacy by mockery and by dismantling the very infrastructure that made things work. We watched as Donald Trump in 2018 dismantled an infrastructure that was designed to respond to a global pandemic. That was done under the auspices of the Republican Party, and more importantly, it was not reviled by the Republican Party. Democrats are often known as the protectors of government. One of the reasons for doing so is that good governance takes work. It does not happen overnight. You cannot scale up good government in a moment, and we have watched that play out when the United States could not respond to COVID-19 as 100,000 Americans died, despite us being the wealthiest nation on earth. That is a direct result of not only a diminution of public administration as an infrastructure, but it's also been the diminution of science as a legitimate source of information. One of the reasons Taiwan has been so successful is that her vice president is an epidemiologist. She listened to experts, and we have watched the mockery, the rejection, and the undermining of experts. The CDC put out guidelines to tell states how to reopen safely. They were hushed. The guidelines were rewritten to make them suggestive, but to also remove the hard and fast rules that any good scientist, any good epidemiologist would tell you have to follow. And so I will put the genesis of this challenge in the 21st century absolutely on the shoulders of the Republican Party, but Democrats have suborned this by sometimes kowtowing to this notion in order to win elections, as opposed to pushing back and speaking to the nature of the bureaucracy we have that came about because good Democrats and good Republicans in past examples of crises stood together to respond to the problems. This is a modern manifestation of, I think, what has been a long-term challenge, but I don't believe that either party has long-term the moral high ground on how we run government. But I do believe that when you abdicate your responsibility, as Republicans have by and large, then you find yourself in the crisis we're in with very little wiggle room for who should be held accountable.
There's a question from Trevor Williams from Global Atlanta. And Trevor says that President Trump would argue that he's got more leverage on the Taiwan issue than ever before precisely because he's challenged China on creating a consensus that and has helped build a consensus domestically that China's taken advantage of the multilateral system. You call Taiwan a nation state. China would reject that. They argue that Taiwan is a province of China and that it is not a nation state. How do you square that?
Well, I mean, look, since Nixon, we have ceded to China its authority and we have weakened our defense of Taiwan. But I would point out that if we had adequate leverage, Taiwan would have been made an observer by the World Health Organization. But at the time that decision was being made, the United States had promised under Donald Trump to pull its dollars out, which gave China a vacuum to step into. And they did not threaten to remove their dollars. They used their soft power to keep Taiwan out of the conversation, even though Taiwan has done an excellent job. And even at the World Health Assembly, if you look at the nation states that were asked to vote on whether Taiwan could be an attendee, most of those nations that voted are currently receiving some form of humanitarian support from China, and they are not getting concomitant support from the United States. And so I do think that we have an international conversation that continues over the nature of what Taiwan should be. I believe it is a nation state, and until such time as it is reabsorbed into China, I'm going to support Taiwan's existence. But I will also point out that we are watching China in the moment. Just yesterday, they voted to essentially take Hong Kong off the map and put Hong Kong within the penumbra of their authoritarian regime, and that we are not able as a nation to push back very hard because we have not done our work. And I would also point out that what we have seen from Donald Trump has been erratic. It has been fairly tantrum driven as opposed to results driven. And that has weakened our ability to hold any leverage over China, which is why we are watching China take the positions it's taking, refuse to give the information we needed early, and refuse to provide the support and even the tacit support of Hong Kong that we once saw.
Zach Holland asks, what actions can ordinary citizens take to fight against voter suppression?
So let's understand what voter suppression is. Voter suppression is three things. It's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And does your ballot get counted? And those three things have a multitude of different iterations depending on the state you're in. But fundamentally, the question of voter suppression is an eligible American denied access to the right to vote? And it usually happens in one of those three ways. And so the best things to do, one, to make certain that we're holding our local leaders accountable for voter registration, especially in today's climate where a number of people cannot go in person to register. And we are finding that people are not being kept on the rolls. There are 9 states that allow you to be purged from the rolls simply for not having voted in previous elections. But there are 44 states that use this general approach to thin out their rolls. So you need to make sure your friends, your family, the people you barely like, they should make sure that they're registered. And you should provide information, but you should also be advocating for access to online registration. Georgia has it, not every state does. But we also need same-day registration, particularly in light of COVID-19. There are going to be people who thought they were registered and who did not meet the statutory guidelines because they didn't know they weren't until they show up to vote. And because Georgia is one of the states that has a registration deadline, there are going to be people who show up to vote who otherwise are eligible and should have been eligible, but will have no ability to cure the defect because they won't find out until they try to cast their vote. Number 2, it's making sure that our polling places aren't reduced. There's going to be the argument that there aren't enough people to man every polling place. But the reality is that people's access to polling places is designed and designated based on their location where they live, not based on the number of people who can work in a space. And if you're especially dealing with populations that have lack of access to public transit, there can be limits to their ability to go, instead of 1 mile from their home, to go 10 miles. That's why early voting is so critical, but it's also why we need to get as many people to vote from home so that the number of workers needed in each polling place can be diminished, but the polling places can remain. And then lastly, we need to advocate for the HEROES Act. This is not a partisan issue. Democrats and Republicans get COVID. Democrats and Republicans face the risk, especially if they're elderly, of being more susceptible to the disease. If we expand access to voting by mail, and if we get the federal investment necessary, because no state can solve the COVID crisis on their own, if we get those resources poured into the states, then more people will be able to participate and will be able to set the direction of our nation for the next decade. That's why we all have to do this. But that means calling your senators and demanding that they invest in the right to vote for Americans across the board around the country.
When I moved to Atlanta 5 years ago from California, I registered right away to vote in Georgia, but I did not unregister in California. I'm probably still on the polls there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems like a flaw in our system.
Well, no. So every state has some version of verifying that you're still there. They will look at how many. So I actually support the law, the underlying law that says you can look at whether someone has voted recently or not to assess whether they should remain on the rolls. The difference is using as an absolute disqualifier the number of elections they voted in is not right. There are a number of states that what they do is they use your failure to vote as a flag to check the coroner's report to see if you died and check your mailing records to see if you moved. But they do not use it as an automatic reason to take you off of the rolls. And the reality is the presumption should be that people are eligible to vote until they have been proven ineligible. The United States is one of the only major democracies that does it in reverse, that strips you of your rights simply because of a failure of bureaucracy to demonstrate your right to vote. And the reality is you're not trying to vote in California. And as long as you're not trying to vote in California, now if you tried to vote in California and vote in Georgia, you would be proof of an antithetical that I cannot imagine. We do not have a voter overage problem in the United States. We do not have too much turnout. Our challenge is making sure that people want to vote and that they can vote. And if we solve those baseline problems, then we can work on the very marginal questions of the handful of people every year who either make mistakes or misunderstand the law. There's very little intentional voter fraud or electoral fraud. And typically when it happens, it is so unusual, they get caught.
Okay, great. That's a great answer. I've got a question here from Councilman Amir Faroqi. He says, it has been said that in politics, foolish certainty usually trumps fragile wisdom. How do we in our politics, especially with COVID-19, domestically and globally, give fragile wisdom the best chance of success?
We have to bolster it. Fragile wisdom is only fragile because it lacks the adherents and the supporters who lift it up and provide those guardrails to protect it from attacks of foolish certainty, but also who are willing to amplify it to give it greater voice. And the reality is that our issue is not a question of do we know what to do? It's are we willing to do it? Every time we support bad decisions or refuse to call bad decisions out, we are suborning foolish certainty. And when we give primacy to the false god of economic restoration as opposed to the real notion and the reality that we see of certain challenge and death when we do not do the right thing, we must give fragile wisdom as much support as possible. I understand the sense of urgency to restore our economy, but let's be clear. I ran a small business. I've run a few of them. I can't sell my product to customers that don't exist. And if my customers are afraid of dying in order to buy my product, my declaration of openness is not going to move them. But what will help is if we follow the science that says we may have to have a little more pain before we can get to recovery, then let's endure the pain, because that's why we built a federal government. Our issue is not one of lack of resources. We have the resources at a federal level to support and invest and to sustain us through this pandemic. Jerome Powell is no one's notion of a liberal. I don't think he's ever been assailed as being a progressive, and he will tell you that the challenge to our economy with a false reopening is that we will have a very real collapse that will be even harder and harsher and more widespread and longer term if we do not do it right. And again, going back to the fundamental notion that the United States should be an international leader, what we do sets the pace for what others do. And when our pace is too fast and our fall is too quick, then we are going to be the creator of a global, not only pandemic, but a global economic depression that we will be too long in recovering from and responding to.
Jeremy Coles from the Southeastern Office of UNICEF points out how severely children, both in the United States and around the world, are being impacted by COVID. Missing meals in school, missing education, being in crowded homes where sometimes that's not particularly safe. What can the United States do to better address child well-being, both here at home and around the world?
I think first by acknowledging the deep vulnerability of this population. I've done three things in the last few months that have pointed to this challenge. One, I worked with a state representative down in Southwest Georgia who was desperately calling around the country trying to find face masks for the volunteers that were serving lunch to kids who were put out of school in one of the poorest school districts, not only in the state of Georgia, but in the nation. And the fact that a state representative had to step in and do a job that should have been done on the statewide or national level is a direct example of the dysfunction that we currently face in our democracy and in our governance. Number two, we just worked with a donor, a food manufacturer, to deliver 800,000 servings of meals in Alabama, Georgia, and Florida because the food insecurity being faced by our communities is exacerbated by COVID-19. It was not created by it, but has been dramatically exacerbated by it. And as a private citizen, the fact that I had to work to find those meals, to get those foods delivered to communities that did not have access, to food banks that are straining at the seams, is deeply problematic. And again, is a solvable problem if we had a functional government that was actually addressing it. And then third, we know that internationally, I've been in conversations with my friend Michelle Nunn and the work that CARE is doing. We know that internationally, the work that has to be done begins by acknowledging that this is not going to simply go away if we close our eyes and wish it to be so. And so our responsibility, especially the responsibility of those on this call, is to lift up these challenges and to put it starkly in the face of our leaders to demand action. We chatter among ourselves about this, but unless we do what we can to raise it in public spaces, to call for behavior and call for action. I know UNICEF has been doubling down on its outreach, but you need allies who are willing to hold leaders accountable regardless of party, because the notion of leadership is that we respond to challenges, not that we simply acknowledge that they exist and move on and go about our merry way.
We're getting towards the end. I've got questions, and I apologize to people that I've not been able to ask. Can you just talk for a second about George Floyd and what happened in Minneapolis and the response to that, both in Minneapolis, LA, Memphis, around the country?
George Floyd is one more example of the injustice in our system. And I want to tie his murder to what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, what happened to Breonna Taylor. And I use those three because they happened in the last 6 months. But let's look at what happened. In each of those instances, those who are responsible or who saw themselves as responsible for justice meted it out without regard to accountability and responsibility. What happened to George Floyd was that a police officer used his power to silence a man unnecessarily and in a way that not only took his life, but put in very sharp relief a lack of regard for his humanity. What we saw happen with Breonna Taylor was a no-knock warrant that allowed the police to break into her house and murder her in her sleep because they went to the wrong place. And what happened with Ahmaud Arbery was that vigilantes took his life, but law enforcement refused to hold them accountable. I believe that we need effective law enforcement. I support the responsibility and the authority that they are given, but authority must always come with accountability. And what we have seen happen in the last 20 years is an erosion of that accountability, and instead this notion that there are certain lives that are not worth being lifted up and being preserved. That is a national challenge, because while these may be incidents that come to our attention, they are indicative of a longer term pattern. And when I ran for governor, I met with members of law enforcement, and what they will tell you is they need the support. They need access to mental health care because it is a dangerous and soul-sucking job sometimes that they have to do. They need the support. They need the ability to ask for help when they need it, but that they also sometimes lack the training to understand the difference between someone you're angry with and someone you're afraid of. That is the responsibility we have as leaders. My belief is that we have to look at what happened to George Floyd, what happened to Breonna Taylor, what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, and look at those as a call to action. I believe in criminal justice reform. When someone commits a crime, they should be held accountable, but they should also have the ability to re-enter and return as citizens. But on the other side of the conversation, our justice system only works if people believe it is just. And every time we have an incident like this, that notion that justice is real is eroded. The last thing I'll say is this. When protests happen among certain communities, they are lauded as opposition. When they happen among African Americans, they're treated as riots. And the difference in how we address the righteous and legitimate anger is something we have to grapple with as a nation, and we have to take into account. What the police did in Minnesota in response to those protests, I believe was overreaction. And there should be the capacity for people to be angry without fearing for their lives. I don't condone violence on either side, but I do believe that we have to meet the moment with the understanding that, especially in the midst of a pandemic where people's sense of self and humanity is of heightened anxiety, that we have to meet that anxiety with more grace and more patience than we normally would. Just as I would say the police did when armed gunmen stormed the Michigan State House to protest having to wear masks.
Wow. Stacey Abrams, thank you so much. This has been, the 45 minutes has flown by. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate your coming, and I appreciate you as a foreign policy wonk, and invite you to come back. I hope you'll join us again in a couple of months, and I really enjoy talking with you.
It would be my delight. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you all for the very thoughtful questions and the grilling. I appreciate it.
Oh, that's so cool. Thank you so much. Next week, stay tuned, y'all. We've got two great programs coming up. We've got Dr. Stephen Morrison, who's the Vice President for Health Policy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. We did a program with Steve, must be 2 months ago. It's on COVID and the U.S. response to COVID, what we ought to be doing. Please watch him next week. It's going to be great. This is on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, we have Doug Shipman, the CEO of the Woodruff Art Center, talking about how the arts are surviving. Can they survive during a pandemic when we're all at home? Thank you very much, Tony Lemieux. Thank you to the Atlanta Global Studies Center for sponsoring this program today. And I want to thank all of you members of the World Affairs Council. It's your support that makes this possible. Almost everybody watching today is a member of the World Affairs Council. Some of you are guests. If you're a guest, join the council. We need your support so we can keep doing these programs. Thank you all very much, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.